June 6, 1944, Whiterstands Nest 62, Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. We will experience the battle entirely through Axis eyes. Dawn lifts like a blade over gray water. A German sentry blinks salt from his lashes and sees the channel turning into ships. Orders crackle, hold fire, conserve belts, wait for the range. Then the horizon moves, barges, tanks, smoke-laying craft, the sea itself advancing. Through the embrasure, the world becomes math angles, meals traverse elevation, until the first ramp drops, and men pour out faster than a gun can breathe. In this view, valor is not the variable, throughput is, and the Atlantic Wall, so solid yesterday, suddenly feels thin. June 1-5, 1944, Atlantic Wall sectors from Pas-de-Calais to Normandy occupied France. Before the storm broke, confidence ruled the briefings. Concrete teeth bit every beach. Casemates wore steel. Fields bristled with stakes and mines. Staff officers traced neat arcs over sand tables, pre-sighted kill zones, interlocking fields of fire reserves poised to counterattack. Intelligence swore the main blow would strike Pas-de-Calais. Radar screens and patrols confirmed nothing decisive off Normandy. Propaganda had seasoned belief the enemy was mechanical, predictable, late to act in foul weather. Ammunition was tallied belts, linked guns bore sighted. Range cards inked crisp numbers. Meteorology promised rough seas the perfect ally. Pioneers rehearsed charges, signalers checked lines, batteries calibrated to the meter. From the embrasures, the channel looked obedient, the beaches tidy with obstacles, the timetable ours to dictate. Beneath that certainty hid an assumption we never tested, that our wall, once finished, could outlast not just courage but capacity. We saw ships and soldiers. We did not see the supply river behind them or how fast it could rise. They laughed because the arithmetic looked easy from the embrasures. The Atlantic Wall converted beaches into abacuses, rows of stakes teeth of concrete lanes sighted by machine guns that had already measured every yard of sand. Against that, Allied landings seemed a crude wager, men stepping into geometry. In briefings and barracks talk, the caricature of the enemy did the rest. Americans, we were told, fought with comforts as much as rifles, coffee, chocolate, warm boots, cigarettes. British, cautious to a fault, preferred paperwork to risk. If a blow came at all, it would wait for perfect tide and perfect sky. Imperfect weather was ours. We judged their weakness to be amphibious blood and time. Landing craft, low and thin-skinned, were mortally dependent on tide and approach lanes. A crosswind could drive them off sectors. A surf could break their ramps. A sandbar could stall them under pre-sighted arcs. Tanks would drown off the ramps if the sea turned fickle. Amphibious contraptions with canvas screens were objects of ridicule in gun pits, where steel and concrete wrote the catechism. Naval gunfire, we assumed, could be bluffed by camouflage and survived by depth. Once the first minutes passed with casemates intact, the wall's logic would cascade, kill the first wave, disrupt the second counterattack, the third. Intelligence fed our confidence with patterns we wanted to see. The great port of Calais, closest to England, beckoned like a magnet. Every decoy, every radio murmur that hinted at Pas-de-Calais hardened bias into belief. Normandy, by contrast, lacked a major harbor, therefore, any blow there would be a feint, a raid at best. Ports were king. Without them, the enemy could not maintain a bridgehead. We did not know about floating harbors or causeways on pontoons or pipelines that crawled under the sea. To men who had raised concrete against tides, such ideas sounded like fairy tales. We counted their aircraft as a condition of weather, not a constant of war. If the channel went dirty, low-cloud rain squalls, the Allied air armadas would sit grounded like sulking gulls. Our supply columns would move, our reserves would shift. The air that had hunted us for months would become merely wind again. We repeated this to one another because it carried the taste of relief. We had lived under a sky that saw too much. To imagine it blind for a day was to imagine victory. We also believed in our gunners' composure. Naval fire was fearsome, yes, but it was distant and abstract. What killed men on beaches was the metronome at the embrasure, traverse fire, correct fire welded to range cards that turned chaos into repeatable work. The enemy would be shocked by how much of the shoreline we had turned into a machine. Belts linked, headspace set, spare barrels within reach. The sand would do what sand does, slow trip swallow. Our mortars would comb lanes pre-registered to the yard. Our guns would pluck men from shallows before courage could become momentum. Above all, we mocked their tempo. Coalition armies were committees, we said, inching forward behind doctrine. They would respect the clock H-hour, this D-Day, that, and if we bled them early, they would ask their commanders for permission to continue bleeding. We would seize the initiative inside their procedures, rush reserves down good French roads, throw armored claws at their soft maritime belly. Once the surf turned red and hesitation set in, ships would back away temporarily, a word that means permanently when politics breathes down a general's neck. We were not fools. We had seen their factories proof in Russia and Italy. But between fear and laughter, laughter is the easier shield. We picked at every seam we believed we saw the sea that punishes the craft, that broach and drown the tanks that do not swim, the air that does not fly in weather, the coalition that cannot decide, the army that cannot supply without a port. We mistook the surface of things for their depth. We measured a wall and forgot to measure a system, and in that forgetting our mockery felt like insight. Before the storm there is a hush that feels rehearsed. It begins with ordinary sounds amplified by dread, the tick of a watch under a glove, a thermos cap twisting, the faint clink of a belt of 7.92. NATO, no, we still call it Mauser settling against steel. The bunker breathes in mineral cold. Condensation beads on the periscope, draws a trembling line, falls. Outside, the tide whispers its numbers along obstacles we planted in tidy rows. Inside the range card waits a doctrine in pencil. Final checks move like liturgy. The gun teams pass spare barrels hand to hand, touch tools as if blessing them. The loader curls his fingers around the first belt, feeling for the mistrustful snag that ruins a burst. A runner from the battery stumbles in cheeks rouged by wind and leaves a slip with the latest Met corrections, air-dense wind, slight left to right. The sergeant of engineers pulls his scarf down to murmur to the lieutenant. Fuses are set. Teller mines wired, Goliath tracks cold, but ready if the beach grows crowded. In a corner, a radio hums with low voices, net discipline, harsh as a schoolmaster's cane. On the wall, a map of sectors glows under a hooded lamp. Pins wink like fireflies that forgot to die with summer. The minutes lengthen. In towers farther along the coast, someone swears he sees nothing. At another, someone swears he sees too much. Weather has turned cat's paw, cloud scraps heard. The dawn rain makes intermittent curtains. The sea wears an unhelpful color that cannot decide if it is steel or stone. We have been told in briefings kind, with certainty, that such weather is ours. It blinds aircraft, muffles observation, punishes seamanship. We drink that comfort down like contraband. The problem is not fear. Fear is a companion we know by first name. The problem is architecture. The wall was built by men with measuring tapes and poor schedules by commanders who believed concrete could fix time. But time resents being fixed. Time is a road behind an army, a port emptier than yesterday at dawn and fuller than yesterday at dusk. Time is a truck that does not break because the part that would have broken has already been replaced by a clerk's superstition. In the quiet waiting for whatever the channel decides next, a few of us feel this but cannot frame it. We do not yet know the words floating harbor prefabricated key pipe under the ocean. We only know that the enemy has made a habit of arriving bigger on the second day than on the first. A gull's cry saws the air. The sentry at the slit blinks, then stills. Smoke on the water, he says, not as poetry, but as diagnosis, screens blooming low like gray hedges. The lieutenant climbs to the periscope, rotates slowly, stops. Nothing then, something then, too many somethings to be dismissed. The radio stiffens with new traffic, coastal batteries asking for confirmation, Sector HQ asking for calm, a panzer regiment, far back in the grid, asking for fuel that is not at present theirs to have. The word deception passes from mouth to mouth, thin as prophylactic hope. We work our list. Final arming, final ranging. The men in the casemate exchange unfunny jokes. Someone mentions Rommel. Someone else mentions leave. The youngest asks if the tide will be kind. No one answers. The sea does not read orders. The first real shapes emerge where horizon used to live, low and ungainly tugs and barges and landing craft that seem too many to be arrayed, and too coherent to be weather's whim. "Hold fire," the captain says quieter than the doctrine warrants. Hold. It is not yet our beach. It is still theirs, the seas. And here is the untold problem, not the enemy's courage or our lack of it, not the thickness of concrete or the number of belts, but our map of what war can be. We have drawn it inside the shoreline and pinned it to a schedule. We have trusted the wall to force the enemy to play our game. Outside, the sea begins to deliver a different game, one that starts with ships, continues with floating streets, and ends with roads that lead inland as if the land had always planned to be invaded. The interval between silence and shock closes like two fingers. The captain's hand rises the signal we have waited for, all night, all month, all year. The belts are snug, the sights are true, the men are ready. The storm is not coming. It is already here. June 1-5, 1944, south coast of England, Eastern and Western Task Force Assembly Areas, English Channel. Shift the lens. Step behind the curtain the gunners on the wall never saw. In chalked lanes across southern England, military police hold up paddles that say simply, "Follow me," and an entire civilization obeys. Convoys numbered like sentences move at walking speed. Headlights, hooded wheels, whispering past hedgerows that have never heard so much American English. In marshalling camps hidden under netting load tables are read like scripture. Each craft, a paragraph of war riflemen, Bangalore torpedoes, assault engineers, bulldozers, medics, radios, rations, water, and the one measure that will matter most after the surf momentum. The impossible idea is not merely cross. It is arrive complete. It is a decision to bring a port in pieces and nail it to a hostile shore, to build roads that float, to promise fuel that travels through a pipe laid under the ocean, to make the second day heavier than the first. In shipyards and quarries, men who have never seen Normandy fabricate it. Caissons taller than houses, phoenix, sinkable boxes of concrete. Floating roadways. Whale with hinges like knuckles. Pierheads spud that walk with the tide on steel legs. Old ships are given new final orders, become reefs, gooseberries, and die on cue to break the channel's temper. Weather is recruited like an officer. In an office where maps of isobars look like sketches of fate group. Captain James Stagg tells generals what the sky will allow, how a breath of improvement will slip between storms on June 6th. The invasion is not postponed by fear, but scheduled by mathematics, wind force, swell height, cloud, base tide. H-hour is chosen because the sea will not argue too loudly, and the beaches will show their metal teeth at just the right angle for engineers to cut them out. Under bigot stamps and guards who count every clipboard twice, deception plays its long hand. Dummy armies glare at Pas-de-Calais. Radio nets mumble lies. Rubber tanks gleam in photographs designed for German eyes. The impossible idea is not only to appear in Normandy, but also to appear elsewhere louder. In the Channel, minesweepers advance hours ahead, combing the dark with wire and courage. They draw lanes as narrow as confessionals and name them with letters a coxswain can carry in his mouth when fear dries it. Dog white easy red. Jig Nan. Behind them, the sea gains a grammar: LSTs that eat tanks, LCAs that cradle platoons, LCTs that cough up Shermans, LCI-LS with gangways like open arms, rocket barges that will right the shoreline in fire. The Western Task Force gathers for Utah and Omaha. The Eastern Task Force gathers for Gold Juno Sword. Around them loiters an Air Force not merely counted in aircraft, but in rolls and timing pathfinders, fighter bombers to rake the exits, heavies to shake the hinterland fighters to make daylight belong to the invader. What the wall cannot see is how deeply habit has been drilled. Riflemen rehearse through mock lanes whose obstacles are labeled in the enemy's language. Engineers heft charges cut to the centimeter. Naval gunfire teams memorize a shoreline of pillboxes they have never touched. Loadmasters in cavernous LST bellies check chalk marks against manifests. A sergeant runs a finger down a column of serial numbers like reading the future. Every piece knows its place. Every place is a promise. It looks like complication. It is simplification, thousands of moving parts trained to behave as one. The invasion is not a leap. It is a bridge made of time and steel already halfway across the water before the first ramp drops. That is the impossible idea, an armada that is also a factory, arriving not as a gamble, but as a plan that has been living in warehouses and on railheads for months, waiting only for the weather to say now. June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach, Normandy. France wider fires from Utah Gold, Juno sword rolling on the flanks. Night loosens its grip, and the horizon begins to hiss. Out ahead, pencil-thin silhouettes glide minesweepers marking truth with buoys. Then the line of rocket craft shudders. LCTRS exhale in sheets and the sea toward the wall erupts as if struck by hail from below. Moments later, the big guns speak in paragraphs. Battleships Texas, Arkansas, Nevada, and Royal Navy veterans warspite Ramillies lay down sentences of steel that end in period after period on casemate roofs. Cruisers rake traverses. Destroyers advance until beach obstacles scrape their keels, trading elegance for geometry, and firing point-blank into embrasures named on their maps weeks ago. The sky is not an omen, but a schedule. Bombers that failed to see through cloud have already pounded inland road nets and rail yards, making the exits from the beach the true battlefield. Mediums and fighter bombers prowl at first light. When a battery flashes a swarm, answers trigger fingers synchronized with radios barely above a whisper. Above them all, the air superiority that took months to win hangs like a force field. The Luftwaffe is a rumor everyone has accounted for and no one meets. Then the surf fills with silhouettes. LCAs bob in ranks, engines chopping the morning into pieces. Coxswains call bearings. Platoon leaders hold their chins high above life vests. Engineers grip Bangalores like oars. A DD tank appears where no tank should, shrugging off waves and skepticism. Another founders and disappears, a theorem overturned by weather. The first ramps drop into water that is deeper than any rehearsal dared, and the sea claims its tacksmen stumble, rifles drown, courage collides with physics. But the ramps keep dropping. On the shingle, the wall's metronome finds its beat bursts that pluck gaps in ranks, mortars that stitch the flat. For terrible minutes, everything is personal. A private's crawl, a medic's reach, a sergeant's shout cut short. The secret sauce is supposed to be firepower, and it is naval gunfire brackets, destroyers walking their shells like bulldozers, but it is also repetition. Waves do not consult casualties before arriving. Every 15 minutes, the sea delivers another paragraph, gap teams with satchel charges, bulldozers with armor that looks insufficient, until it is not teams dragging rubber boats full of explosives toward stakes that were supposed to own the tide line. Engineers clear lanes under a grammar of hand signals that no wind can drown. Commanders afloat adjust the syntax on the fly. A beach that won't be taken straight is taken diagonally. Craft diverted from dog green nose toward easy red. A battalion lands 2 sectors left and becomes the plan by virtue of existing. Shore fire control parties talk to ships as if pointing fingers. A destroyer hears WN-62 still alive and edges closer, closer, until its deck guns can taste sand in the spray. The casemate that was a premise becomes rubble. The traverse that was certainty becomes smoke. From the wall, the scale is the shock. A lull is not a respite, but a rearrangement. Where one gap is sealed by courage and luck, another opens under a shaped charge and a dozer's blade. When a run to the seawall fails, the next one learns and succeeds. The enemy's secret is not a single weapon. It is the refusal to be a single event. Behind each boat is another. Behind each destroyed ramp, a fresh bow wave. Behind each stalled tank, a new one that made the swim. And behind the beach, visible only in glimpses, when a shell peels the mist, float roads and piers that did not exist at dawn and will exist by dusk. By mid-morning, a company that landed as strangers to its map is fighting over a landmark it now owns by breath and blood. Naval guns shift to deeper targets. Field artillery comes ashore in pieces that will soon speak in the inland hedgerows. A chaplain crawls. A signalman unfurls a panel. A bulldozer widens a lane that thousands of boots want. The wall's logic to kill the first wave disrupt the second counterattack. The third meets a grammar that tolerates no missing page. Fire, movement, replacement, repeat. The tide rises, covers the obstacles, and with a small traitorous elegance makes the cleared lanes look like natural breaks in a brutal beach. Through them, the invasion's prose begins to flow inland, and the machine the wall could not imagine starts writing France in a new tense. June 6, 1944, H hour to mid-morning. Wider stands nest 62, and adjacent strongpoints, Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. 0 hour arrives without trumpet, only a new thickness in the air. The first thing to break is not stone but sequence. Reports that should flow in columns spill sideways, smoke, many landing craft, hold fire, hold. The captain's voice is clipped to the stalk. The battery net hisses. The field telephone to the next strongpoint goes dumb between syllables. When the loader slaps the first belt home and the gunner rides the butterfly triggers, the casemate's geometry feels certain again. Men fall in the surf where the range card said they would. The lieutenant's mouth forms the score traverse short, long, and for a time the embrasure owns the grammar of the day. Then the horizon edits back. A destroyer lurches in toward the shallows so close you can smell hot oil on the wind, and its guns walk shells along the parapet, as if it knew the casemate, the way a locksmith knows a door. The intercom squeals. The gunner ducks instinctively and loses the bead. The loader's thumb kisses a hot barrel, and he swears like prayer. Outside, an LCA slews another, catches a wave on her quarter, and vomits men directly into a mortared lane. A DD tank careens broadside, and somehow claws forward its tracks, smearing sea and sand into paste. The metronome inside the bunker tries to hold tempo, but every third beat is swallowed by concussion and dust. Command is a line, and lines hate knives. The first knife is shrapnel that chews through the telephone lead to the company CP. A runner goes in its place. The second knife finds him in a shallow that was supposed to be dead ground. The third knife is rumor Calais is the real blow, somebody repeats, as if saying it could tidy the beach. An artillery correction arrives for a battery that no longer answers. A counterattack instruction is dated yesterday and delivered by a man whose eyes keep jumping to the surf. A pillbox to the right stops firing without an order. Someone says the embrasure jammed. Someone else says the embrasure ceased to exist. The map on the wall patient, as an accountant, loses track of which checkboxes still correspond to places. In the kill zone, men refuse to behave like ink. A squad crawls into a fold of sand, disappears, and then a line of explosions unlaces the obstacles at the tide line. Bangalore torpedoes slide under the stakes and rip a mouth in the beach's iron grin. The machine gun slews burst, the loader slams a fresh belt, the gunner counts tracers, and the lieutenant thinks briefly that the lane can be resown. But the next wave arrives in the same place faster, with a bulldozer snorting behind men who no longer look surprised by the range. A neat logic collapses: kill the first, disrupt the second, counterattack the third. The first only half dies, the second inherits, the third does not wait to be opposed. The Luftwaffe does not come. The sky is not empty if emptiness were mercy, but owned fighter bombers stoop at road junctions inland. Medium bombers drone where our reserves should be. High and thin contrails stitch a ceiling that nothing friendly crosses. A panzer regiment calls for gasoline and is told to wait for orders routed over wires that now dangle in weeds. The staff farther back, faithful to doctrine, asks for confirmations formatted like peace. Up front, the captain stops formatting and starts pointing. Left traverse, short. Mortars rapid on the breach. Engineers prepare the Goliath. The tiny tracked bomb coughs, balks, then coughs again. It lurches 5 meters and dies a parody of armor in a day devoted to the real thing. A destroyer's next salvo skids the casemate's roof like a hand rapping hard on a table. The world whites out, then returns in pieces, wringing grit between teeth, the taste of cordite and plaster. The loader is on his side, blinking. The gunner is talking, but not to us. The lieutenant finds his helmet a step behind his head and decides to leave it there. Through the slit, something monstrous and angular looms, an AVRE perhaps, or simply a dozer, with the soul of a ram pushing a lane wider with a blade that makes the beach itself vote against us. By late morning, the command net sounds like a room of men speaking languages that share only nouns: fire, bridge, gap, withdraw, counterattack, fuel, wounded, mines, left, left, left. A section leader shouts over the din that he can still see water between the enemy and the seawall. If we can hold another 30 minutes, he says, reserves will pinch. 30 minutes is a story the beach refuses to tell. Another wave arrives without negotiation. The seawall disappears under men whose fear has burned down into smaller, more durable fuels. Habit orders a comrade's hand. Someone says, aim low. They're closer than your training thinks, and the next burst does bite. But the next destroyer is closer too, and its answer erases the sentence before it can become a paragraph. The breakdown does not announce itself as collapse. It arrives as silence where a voice should be, as a gun that fires one beat late, as a runner who stares at the radio like a stranger. It arrives as an order unsigned, because the officer who signs is under a ceiling that keeps falling. It arrives as a sergeant who, given a choice between dying in place and dying 10 meters back, where the wounded are, chooses the second, because mercy is still a kind of command. Somewhere behind us, a staff officer draws a counterattack arrow across a map with the self-possession of geometry. Up here, geometry has been replaced by weather. The sea keeps delivering. The road inland, stripped by bombing, does not. The system we trusted, a wall of measured steel, meets a system that moves like water and speaks in waves. The trial is not of courage. Courage is present and insufficient. The trial is of structure, and ours is starting to come apart in the hands. June 6, 1944. Noon to late afternoon. Omaha Beach inland exits Vierville-Colleville sectors, Normandy, France. The recognition is not theatrical. No single trumpet says defeat. It accumulates like weight on a bridge. A lull comes, and for 5 seconds we mistake it for reprieve. Then the lull fills with a whine we have learned to fear, a fighter-bomber's dive somewhere beyond the bluffs, where our reserves were supposed to gather before they pounced. The casemate that survived the morning coughs smoke from seams. The periscope gives back a world blurred by dust. When the lens clears, the beach has changed species. It is no longer an anteroom where we kill time until pushing them into the sea. It is a factory floor. On that floor, processes run. Engineers move in pairs and fours, passing signals with hands because voices waste oxygen. A dozer noses another mouth open in the obstacles. A party of men drags a boat stuffed with explosives as if hauling a stubborn animal. They set and blow, and when the smoke leaves, the stakes that once wrote destiny lie like dead trees. Shore fire control teams, half prone behind tideline shingle, talk to ships that answer as if they had been waiting for these words all their lives. A destroyer inches even closer and rakes the bluff with guns set to a traverse that feels indecently intimate. The embrasure flinches. The decision has already been made on a radio we cannot jam. We had clung to a diagram, first wave shattered, second confused, third counterattacked. The diagram collapses, not because the first wave did not suffer, but because suffering did not interrupt sequence. When a squad vanishes in spray, another slides into the groove its body's cut. Where a tank drowns, another finds a shallower path, because a coxswain learned from a boat he watched die. A company that landed 3 sectors wrong becomes a spear exactly where we did not intend to be pierced. The enemy's courage matters, yes, but courage is not the decisive variable. Continuity is. The wall, we discover, was built to deny a day. The invader brought days. Inland columns that should be forming to counterattack are instead forming at fuel bowsers that do not exist. Roads that should be green avenues for our reserves are gray craters ringing with bees. We send a message for armor. The reply is a doctrine that should have been a truck. A headquarters orders a battalion to move. The battalion asks for air cover. The air answers only with a roar under roundels not ours. The Luftwaffe's absence is no longer an anomaly. It is policy enforced by exhaustion. At the waterline, the enemy assembles weapons from pieces. A gun arrives in 3 parts, and later, when it speaks inland, we will pretend to be surprised. A radio mast unrolls, and a voice we cannot hear becomes a ship we can. A tank backs off a ramp that was not there an hour ago. A pierhead tied to nothing we recognize rises and falls with the tide on legs like a wading insect. We had ridiculed such talk. We are watching it stand. The personal scale shrinks as the industrial scale swells. A medic runs with a litter. A chaplain kneels. A corporal points men toward a culvert that will become a path up the bluff. These are still human acts, and we still meet them with rifles. But above them the view has changed. The sea behind the men is not a horizon, but a reservoir, and it is full. When one boat takes a hit, 3 boats veer, and their wakes draw a new geometry of assault, without anyone ashore having to redraw a map. The invader has more verbs than we have nouns. Around midday, the captain's soot on his cheek-chin, bloody from a splintered strap, says something no doctrine covers save the gun. Not the position, the tool. The men look at him, then at the weapon, then at the beach that wants all of it. They begin to pull back parts they can carry, as if the war will later return to a scale where a single barrel matters. A runner arrives with an order stamped, Gegenangriff sofort. He reads it as a relic reads itself aloud dutifully, without expectation of compliance. The counterattack exists only as ink. The hill between it and us is made of time we do not own. The realization settles oddly gentle. We are not merely losing ground. We are being eclipsed. A system larger than ours is casting a shadow forward, and everything inside the shadow slows misfires or asks for permission it cannot receive. The men remain brave. Bravery no longer purchases outcomes at the old exchange rate. When we hit, the enemy yields and flows around the impact. When we succeed, the success jams in a throat already swallowing more. Late afternoon, a gap we denied all morning becomes an exit and begins to exhale men inland. They move past our wrecked obstacles without looking, as if ruins were scenery baked into their plan. Beyond the exits, smoke marks where our artillery positions used to argue. A sign appears exit D3, and the shock of it is not the letter or number, but the suggestion of bureaucracy in a place we thought belonged to chance. Bureaucracy means schedule. Schedule means supply. Supply means tomorrow. As we step back, some carried, some walking, some led by that quiet, stubborn sergeant who refuses panic. The sea behind the enemy grows busier instead of thin. A wall built to forbid a landing has encountered an opponent that does not land. It arrives. The difference sounds pedantic in peacetime. Under fire, it is the definition of being crushed. June-August 1944, Normandy lodgment to the Cotentin, then the breakout toward Brittany and the Seine. Defeat on the morning shoreline metastasized into a strategic failure that no afternoon counter-order could repair. The Atlantic Wall had been conceived to make invasion a binary question, allowed or forbidden. Omaha proved it was a continuum governed by throughput. Once the beach became a factory floor, the logic of German defense in the west, delay at the waterline counterattack with mobile reserves, restore, the line collapsed into a schedule it could not keep. First, the reserve problem. Panzer formations that doctrine cast as fire brigades were shackled to roads bombed into gravel and to a sky that belonged to strangers. Movement by day invited annihilation. Movement by night bled time. Requests for fuel and freedom of action ran into two absences that behaved like laws, absent gasoline and absent Luftwaffe. The counterstroke that should have bitten the lodgement's throat reached instead for a throat that had already expanded, hardened, and learned. Time, the decisive resource, was being minted offshore in hulls and onshore in prefab piers. Every hour, the Allies' second day arrived heavier than their first. Second, the port thesis died. German planning assumed that without a major harbor, the invader would choke. But Mulberry harbors towed like civic secrets and planted at Arromanches and off Omaha converted coastline into infrastructure. Even when a great storm savaged the American artificial harbor, the system flexed instead of failing. Beaches turned into ports. Cherbourg's ruins were coerced back to service. Small Norman harbors were taught new habits, and supply tables absorbed the weather as if it were merely another column to balance. Pluto pipes under the waves began to turn fuel from a commodity into a utility. The German staff could interdict a convoy. It could not interdict a principle. Third, the Calais fixation broke like a spell. Long after the beaches told the truth, deception, Fusag's phantom and prudence kept German formations guarding the wrong coast as if the invader in Normandy were only a preface. That caution became paralysis. Paralysis yielded ground to numbers. Every German day spent waiting was an Allied day spent building. And building had a cavalry all its own dozers pushing turnouts in hedgerow lanes, combat engineers turning cart tracks into arteries, depots organizing chaos into flow. Tactically, the wall's local strengths casemates that could not be easily killed, fields of fire that made men crawl, translated into attrition, not decision. In the balkage, German infantry bled the invader, yes, but always under a lid of interdiction and a rain of ammunition the invader could afford. When the Americans solved the hedgerow with hedgerow cutters and combined arms drilled to the minute, the tempo shifted from contested increments to cumulative inevitability. The British-Canadian grind fixed armor that might have roamed. American weight prepared Cobra a breach not achieved by elegance, but by pressure that cracked an army's ribs. Strategically, the West here forfeited initiative. After June 6th, it never again chose when to fight, only where to die more slowly. The railways that fed choices lay in ruins. Depots that fed tempo burned as often as they filled. Command that fed coherence spoke increasingly to itself. By late July, the lodgment was no longer a tenuous footprint, but a platform artillery rolled forward as a matter of routine. Airfields flowered like pragmatic miracles in logistics. Officers argued over efficiency, not survival. The Wehrmacht in France, conceived as a mobile defense battering a brittle landing, became a static absorber of blows. The consequence reached beyond Normandy. Once a self-sustaining, ever-thickening base existed on the French coast, the calendar turned traitor to Berlin. Every day added divisions' fuel trucks and replacement parts to one side and subtracted them from the other. Throw them back into the sea, transformed quietly, fatally, into delay their inland sea. But seas rise. With Antwerp later seized and opened with the Seine line compromised, the question ceased to be whether the Allies could be expelled from France. The new question, uncomfortable and final, was how fast a continent-scale machine would roll to Germany's borders and how much of the German army would still be intact to greet it. Aftermath, recollections gathered from field diaries, interrogations, and post-war memoir fragments. I write this without bitterness, because bitterness is a luxury of the well-fed. In the casemate, we believed walls were arguments. The beach taught us they are footnotes. We waited for the counterattack as children wait for a father who works late, certain he will come certain. The key will rattle in the lock. The key did not turn. Not because the father forgot, but because the road home had been bombed to powder, and the car had no fuel. We learned that courage on an empty tank is a prayer with no congregation. There was a moment near noon, perhaps, when I understood what our officers would not say aloud. It was not that their soldiers were better than ours. It was that their losses did not interrupt their plan. We killed men. The plan continued arriving. We smashed craft. The plan arrived on different craft. We suppressed a battery. A ship became the battery until another battery came ashore. We set our watches by disaster and found we were on time only to observe it. After the war, in rooms that smelled of coal dust and soup, we told one another the same sentence in different words: we were brave. It was true and incomplete. The other half was simpler and heavier. They were brave and rich, not in coins, but in time turned into motion, and motion into schedule. Our officers spoke of Schwerpunkt and nerve. Theirs spoke of tonnage and turnaround. I do not mean to romanticize a truck, but a truck that always arrives is a philosophy. A young interrogator asked me what Omaha felt like from inside the wall. I said, like trying to stop the tide with a ruler. He smiled as if I were being poetic. I was being exact. The tide does not argue. It keeps time for itself. We carried our dead up the bluff, and we carried our habits home. When I think of that day now, I do not remember the faces in the surf first. I remember a sign on the beach that appeared before noon, letters and numbers stenciled in a language not mine, pointing inland. The sign was modest, almost polite. It made a promise to the men who followed it this way on schedule. We were not driven back by an army that shouted us down. We were pushed inland by a schedule that never missed its train. If I must use one sentence, it is this: we were fighting a machine. And machines, when well-fed and well-kept, do not tire and do not forget, and do not pause to ask permission of fear.